There's some definite consequences to using industrialized agriculture or having those big monocultures that utilize so much fossil fuels and water and pesticides use. Some of those are about the soil itself. So when we pulled so much water out, we got the water has to come from somewhere, and because industrialized agriculture, we can't support it just based on rainfall or necessarily just what comes out of rivers, especially if we're in areas that are kind of farther away from rivers. And so a lot of times they're drilling and they're using groundwater, and we'll talk a little bit about groundwater resources in some later sections. But when you're pulling out that water, it can actually cause the land to subside or to sink. Um, but we also have soil erosion that happens because of industrialized agriculture. We're plowing a lot. We're turning over the soil. We're letting it dry out. We're breaking up the root structure that actually holds it into place. And so we can have increased soil erosion. And in this picture, just to give you, this is called a gully, which is on the edge of a field. So this is a plowed field over here on the side. And just to give you a little perspective, right down here at the bottom of the picture, which is a little hard to see, this right here is a person. Just to give you a little perspective of size and depth of how big this gully is and the erosion that's happening due to the farming in this area. So it can happen because of farming. It can also happen because of logging or when we overgraze, when we're taking too much. Anytime we're taking too much of the vegetation off of the surface, we can have this consequence of soil erosion. And so not only does it take the soil from the area, so it reduces the amount of fertile topsoil that's in the area, and so we can't grow as much then because we don't have as good a soil. But the soil goes somewhere. There's no way in our on our planet. Everything always has to go somewhere. So there's no like the we say, oh well, the dirt got washed away. Well, but where did it end up? And where it ended up was in a body of water. So it either ended up in a stream or a lake or the ocean, which then has consequences for that body of water. It decreases the clarity of the water, which can increase the temperature of the water. It can change what can live in the water. Um, it can change the depth of the water if too much of the sediment is deposited in there, which then makes it shallower, and the shallower the water is, usually the higher the water temperature is. And so it'll actually change the amount of the species that can survive in that area by increasing the amount of soil erosion. With the soil and the water also come the contaminants with it. So any fertilizers or if there's chemical pesticides or anything like that that have been sprayed on there, those will also concentrate now into that water supply. And so then we have to deal with those side effects as well. When we lose a lot of our topsoil like that, we can actually cause deserts to form. And so if we remove too much of the topsoil and too much of the vegetation that's there, then what we're left with is an area that is not supportive of anything growing in those particular areas. And so we have some areas are more susceptible, especially if they tend to have less rainfall to begin with. They tend to be more susceptible to desertification or the area becoming a desert. Some of it's happening just naturally, would have happened without us, but there's a lot that's happening because of agriculture. When you have an area that is becoming a desert, it actually changes the climate of the region because you have less plants that are transpiring or letting water out of their cells. You have less water in the atmosphere. And so it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. So the droughts can get worse. And obviously, if we have drought, excuse me, and we don't have vegetation that can grow there anymore, that leads to famine or starvation because we're not actually able to grow food in those areas, which can lead to economic loss. So not only can they not feed their own people, but they also can't export at that point either, which then lowers your standard of living because now you don't have as much food, you don't have as much money. And if it gets too bad, then people have to leave, and that's where we get environmental refugees. We have people who leave areas because they can no longer support themselves in those areas. So we have a number of areas around the world where desertification is a concern, and if you look at the areas in our country that are in danger of becoming a desert, it should be a little bit worrisome. So there's a lot of agriculture that happens in those regions. There's a lot of agriculture that happens up in here too. So We have moderate in the yellow, we have the greens are severe, and this band in here, there's a lot of agriculture that happens that supports a large portion of the world. And so it is a serious concern that we protect our soil quality so that we can continue to grow food and we can continue to feed our populations. Another problem comes from salinization and waterlogging, and this happens because of irrigation. So when we irrigate, the water has dissolved solids in it. So salinity is just a measure of the amount of dissolved solids that's in the water. And some areas have more dissolved solids in them than others do. But when we continue to irrigate, we continue to bring those salts into the areas, and then the water will either soak in or it'll evaporate, but it'll leave behind those salts. And that's what this picture is down here. This is an area where you can see water was standing a lot, but it left behind this white crusty kind of film over the top of the dirt, and that's the dissolved solids. And then plants can't grow. There were times in human history, particularly the Roman Empire, when they would actually bring salt with them as for warfare. They would actually salt the fields so that people couldn't grow in areas as they conquered areas. If they didn't want people living in those areas again, they would actually put salt into the fields so that the plants wouldn't grow anymore, and then people wouldn't stay there because they couldn't grow anything. And we're doing this now as we increase the amount of irrigation in particular areas. So we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to reduce the amount of salt in the soil. The other thing is waterlogging. So the top picture here is showing waterlogging. And what happens is you have this clay layer that's on the bottom, that's underneath, kind of where the plants are growing, and it doesn't let water continue to percolate down through through the soil column, and the water just kind of sits there. And so then the roots sit in the water, and it's kind of like overwatering your houseplant. It's the same premise where if you don't have drain holes out of the bottom of your pot, and then the plant just sits in it, it rots the roots away because they're waterlogged. And so two issues that we have that come in with irrigation. So what can we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is reduce irrigation, so then you're using crops that are more drought tolerant, that don't require as much water. Or we're switching to salt tolerant crops, ones that actually will pull the salt out of the soil. And there's some listed there for you: the barley, the cotton, the sugar beets. That's one reason why cotton grows well here, because we have very clayey soils, and so they actually are very tolerant to that salt. That a lot of times comes hand in hand with having clay soils. Now, flushing the soil, that's what this picture is. So this is where they actually dig up the area, and then they put down a crushed gravel layer with the PVC pipe in it, and it has to be sloped down so that as the water comes down through the soil where the plants are growing, it'll go into those pipes, and then it'll gravity feed down, and it'll take it away, and so then you don't have the water logging in that area, and then the salts will actually go down with the water and not stay in the soils, but can be taken away. Obviously very expensive, because they have to, when they're flushing the soil, they're doing it a lot. And there's also that we actually have to put that in the ground, and that's expensive as well. They can use crop rotation, so when they stop growing the crops for 2 to 5 years, they're not putting the extra salts into the soil. Natural rainfall can actually help with flushing the soils out themselves, or you're planting that salt tolerant crop. The underground drainage systems, once again, a lot like the flushing of the soil, very expensive. So not really a very viable solution. When we look at food production and the kind of impacts that food production can have, you can see that there's a lot of different impacts. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. We've talked about some of them as it is already. One of the things we'll talk about is the lack of genetic diversity. This is a very serious concern, because as we have these monocultures where they picked something that grows really well, what it leaves us open to is diseases and insects that really like that particular crop. And so if we have fewer strains of the wild ones to come and cross back into the population, that reduces our crop's ability to withstand insects and disease. So an example of this is in northern Arizona. It's the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world, and it grew that way all by itself. We didn't have anything to do with it. But about 20 years ago or so, we started to have a bark beetle infestation. And so when you drive up to Flagstaff, when you see like all the dead trees, that's because of this bark beetle. And the bark beetle really, really likes ponderosa pine. And because there was this continuous stand of ponderosa pine, and we've been suppressing fires for 100 years, in combination with that, it's allowed the bark beetle to spread quite a lot. If we were allowing natural fire to happen, it would actually kill off a lot of the bark beetles because it would burn the trees that they were in, because the dead trees would burn more, right, than the live trees, and that's where the beetles are in for the most part. So we're losing some of our genetic diversity. We're losing some of those ponderosa pine, and actually a lot of them, because the bark beetles were like yummy. It was like the smorgasbord, and we have some critters that like to feed on things like our corn crops that are like that as well. We'll talk a lot about water when we look at our water unit, but the aquifer depletion is one thing that's of serious concern, because as we increase our food production, especially in areas where there's not a lot of rain and not enough rain to support the food production, we're pulling it out of the ground. And as we take water out of the aquifer, we'll talk later on about what that can do to the ground itself. Air pollution, we'll talk a little bit about that as we get further along. But you'll see that there's a number of impacts on air pollution because of agriculture. Some of them sound a little bit silly, like the methane coming from cows, but it's actually a very real issue. If you're interested in stuff like that, there's a Mythbusters that you can find on YouTube. It's pretty entertaining, but it's also very true when they look at the amount of methane that cows produce. And they have a video where they go to this farm where the farmer has actually made it so that all their electricity can run off of methane gas. And all the methane gas comes from the waste products from the cows. And so, I mean, it's really kind of cool in some ways. But yeah, you can look that up on YouTube if you're interested in stuff like that. We just finished our hazards in human health section. And we talked about chemical hazards. And some of those chemical hazards actually can originate from our agricultural practices. So nitrates come from chemical fertilizers, and that having that increase in our drinking water is not very healthy for us. Some pesticides will have no impact on human health. Some will. So it's having that residue around is not always necessarily the best thing. So what do we do? So we talked about, industrialized agriculture has all these issues and stuff, but what can we do instead of that? Now, the reason we got into the industrialized agriculture was because it was more economically efficient. You could farm more area, grow more crops with less people and with less output, right? With a less financial output than you could with using the older traditional methods of agriculture. So some of the ones that are going to protect biodiversity a little bit more, and they're also going to protect our crop strains as well, are listed on here. So polyvarietal cultivation. Poly means many, varietal is the genetic variety. So that means like growing different varieties of corn in one area. Intercropping is where we space it out, and they'll grow some rows of corn, and then they'll grow some rows of soybeans, and then some rows of wheat and things like that. So they're going to put them, spacing them out together, which will slow the movement of insects and disease. Agroforestry is where we have like rows of corn and then a row of apple trees, and then a row of corn, 2 rows of corn or something like that, and then apple trees. And then polyculture is like your backyard garden. That's where you're growing all sorts of stuff all together. So as we started to industrialize our agriculture here, I want you to think about what was happening in the world in the 1950s. So we were a very isolationist country up until World War II. People still came here from other areas of the world, but because of the Depression and things like that, people didn't really travel a whole lot. They pretty much stayed where they were. But during World War II, you had this whole generation of people that went somewhere else, and they saw how other people lived, and they saw other areas of the world, both in Europe and in Africa, and in the islands, in the Pacific, and in areas. And so for some, there became that really great desire to help others and to help end hunger in other parts of the world. And we started to have this industrialization, kind of second industrial boom that happened in our country, and we started to switch over from the mom and pop farms into the companies and corporations started to buy them up, started to use the bigger farm machinery. And we tried to export some of our agricultural practices to other areas of the world. So we're exporting our industrialization, for one thing, using the bigger tractors and using more machinery as opposed to people. But then we also tried to figure out some strains and varieties using crossbreeding and cross-pollination of varieties of food that would live better in areas with less water in particular. So the dwarf varieties of rice were just shorter, they were smaller, and wheat also. So they were more drought tolerant. They tried to breed them to be more salt tolerant. So the Green Revolution was really about using varieties that were already there and using natural selection basically, and actually like crossing over like Mendel did and cross-pollinating and creating these new varieties. The Green Revolution was not GMOs yet. We're not that far yet. So right now they were just looking at varieties that already existed and moving them into other areas. It wasn't until the 1980s when we really started to see the gene revolution, or the next part that came over. So, but the hard part about this was we tried to take our agricultural methods that worked here, we tried to put them into an area where they didn't have as much water, they didn't have as good soil quality, and they didn't have just the capital really to do any of this kind of stuff. And so it didn't really work out quite as well as we had hoped. So they started to have a lot of the same problems that we had here. They just had them faster there because the areas, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it just wasn't, the land wasn't sufficient for the kind of agricultural practices that we were trying to export to them. So we ended up, and then we tried to send seed. Seed didn't always make it. Seed didn't always grow there. That kind of thing. Another thing that's happened to us with industrialization is that loss of the genetic variety. So we talked about this a little bit already, and corn's been a big concern of this because we used to have lots of different varieties of corn. Corn actually, the modern corn and the modern wheat didn't exist about 300 years ago. They're actually things that we as humans started crossing over and cross-pollinating and causing to become the thing that it is today. Corn actually started as a grass species, and it was the crossing of many grass species that resulted in the corn that we have today. So in the United States, we grow primarily one type of corn, and in the 1990s, we had a problem where we had a blight that came in and started killing off all the corn crop, and nothing could stop it because it was all the same variety. So it just kept going, it kept spreading through all the corn crops. They were able to go down into Mexico and find some strains of corn that were resistant to this blight, and they were able to crossbreed that back into our corn crops, and actually saved our corn supply, which was the majority of the world's corn supply. So that making sure that the genetic variety still exists around the planet is really important to our food supply, so something like that doesn't happen again. So the Green Revolution led into the Gene Revolution, and this is where we talk about genetically modified organisms, and this is where we take traits from one organism and we place them into another organism. So it could be making a plant more salt tolerant or more drought tolerant. It could be that it makes the fruit size larger, or it makes the skin a little bit thicker so that it, like the current apples are not like apples were before we started genetically modifying, because they made the skins thicker so they wouldn't get as damaged during shipping. We've genetically modified the majority of the food that you eat at this point has been genetically modified. So we've been doing some of this through artificial selection like forever, since people started agriculture, where we just chose the ones that had the better genes, and so we crossed those, and so we got the kind of traits that we liked. It wasn't until the 1980s where we actually started doing it in a laboratory, and that's really the big difference between artificial selection and genetic engineering, is that we're actually taking it, and we can start to take genes from things that wouldn't normally cross one another, so from different species, and we can include those in there. We can also include genes that into, for example, into a plant to make it resistant to a certain pesticide or to an herbicide, so that when they want to spray an herbicide to get rid of the weeds, then it doesn't impact the crop species. Like corn has been, most of the corn has been genetically modified to be what they call Roundup ready, which means that they can spray Roundup on the corn and it won't kill it. We've genetically engineered corn to have a trait that's called Bt in it, which is actually a soil bacteria, which in the corn borer, which is a large pest in corns, it actually bores into the corn cobs and stuff and makes them, and they eat it, and then it rots. Well, this Bt, Bacillus thermalis, will actually act in the gut of the insect and causes it to cleave or tear apart in it, and so it kills the insects from the inside out, but it has no impact on our guts because ours are different than the insect gut, and so it doesn't hurt people, but it only hurts the insect. And so there's lots of different reasons and functions that we've had for altering the genes of different species. So there's some definite advantages to that. We can have a higher yield, we can spray less pesticides, we can grow in regions where we wouldn't necessarily have been able to grow in those before. But there's still some unknown. So these are projected disadvantages because they haven't been in our food supply long enough. When you do scientific studies, especially on human populations, they have to be over long periods of time. And so we don't necessarily know what all of the side effects will be of this. At this point in time, most of the research that you'll see does not show significant side effects for people. So the jury's still kind of out because it's going to take some time to collect data and information on genetically modified crops. So one of the big controversies, though, is over the legal ownership. So in the 1980s, Monsanto is a company that grows a lot of seed, and they're the ones that have the Roundup ready, so you can spray the corn. So, but it's also in soybeans, so it's not just corn plants. And so up in Canada, there was this farmer who had he was growing his crops, and he's been saving his seed, and the farm has been in his family for 100 years, and they save the seed, and that's a very traditional thing to do. So you sell some of it, and then you keep some of your crops for seed for the next year, so you don't have to purchase more seed. And Monsanto came onto his property, and they tested his crops, and they found that their gene for their Roundup Ready crop was in the genetic makeup of his plants. And so they sued him for patent infringement. Well, he never purchased their seed. He never used any of their seed. But either through contamination through cross-pollination from another field, or because someone spilled seed along the road, it actually contaminated his seed supply. And this court case went on for years, like decades actually, until it took almost 20 years for him to finally win and say that he didn't owe Monsanto anything then there was did Monsanto actually owe him something for contaminating his seed supply? But it caused a lot of people who that was their business was to save seed. It actually caused a lot of them to go out of business because they were concerned about being sued about helping people with patent infringement, essentially. So that's actually been a very large controversy, is about the seed part of it and who owns the gene, and how does that impact when you didn't need to have it in your field, and how do you keep it out of your field if you don't want it?